And if you have any technical issues, we'll just scroll the chat feature all the way to the top. You'll see my cell phone number. And you can just send me a text once Representative Ivory gets going, and I'll walk you through whatever we need to do. Feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box. We'll start with those when we get into the Q&A, and then we'll open it up to everybody. And let's see, I think we've pretty much covered it. I've had the pleasure of getting to meet Representative Ivory a couple of years ago when he came up to Okanogan County to our annual Farm Bureau dinner and gave us a lesson on the American Lands Council and the transfer of federally controlled lands. It's certainly a hot issue right now. We see a lot of really what do we want to say? Utah is kind of on the forefront of the Western states as far as transfer of the federally controlled lands. I saw that, 17th Amendment repeal that came through. So Representative Ivory is the CEO of the American Lands Council. And since I'm the only one on the call, I'm not going to talk too much because I've got a bunch of people trying to get in. So I'm going to let you, Representative Ivory, if you just want to get started, give us a background on the American Lands Council, what you're doing, and why the transfer of federally controlled lands is so important, particularly for those of us in the Western states.
Right. Thank you, Pam. It's the essence of who we are in our nation. We promise ourselves, we promise the world at the very beginning of this experiment that we are the land of liberty. We're the land of equal opportunity and fundamental fairness, and the ability to determine our own destiny is fundamental to the great American experiment. And that's the promise that we make. Well, when you look at this map, let me see if I can get that there. When you look at that map, we've fundamentally violated that very basic promise of America. And if you think about throughout our nation's history, whenever we've violated our promises, whenever we're not living in harmony with who we say we are, there is not peace and prosperity. Discord deepens, frustration festers, and happiness and prosperity plummet. And that's where we are. And so I'm very confident in what we're doing because it is in line with the very basic nature of who we are as a nation, what we stand for, who we say we are. And so we can be out of harmony with that for a while and wallow in that frustration for a while. But much like Winston Churchill said, he said, we can count on the Americans to get it right after they've exhausted all the other options. And so we can exhaust all the other options in how we treat the Western states on property, but eventually we're going to get it right. We can't continue to burn 10 million acres of forested lands a year. We can't continue to run people off their lands, to close down thousands of roads every year, to pollute our air worse than smokestacks and tailpipes, to incinerate wildlife in the millions, and to destroy the economy and the way of life of people all throughout the West to the detriment of the nation. We simply can't continue to do that. And so I'm very confident that we'll get this right, much as we have many other things. So I'd like to start with just kind of the basic fundamentals of why it matters in our system, and then we'll progressively get deeper on this specific issue. When you think about who we are as a nation, you look at the Constitution, and the Constitution is a beautifully simple document. Article 1 is the powers of Congress. Article 2, the powers of the executive. Article 3 of the courts. Article 4, the rights of and obligations to the states. four branches of government, not three, four branches of government. Article 5 is how we amend it. Article 6 is the engagements clause, the supremacy that laws made in pursuance of the limited powers delegated to the federal government are the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 is the ratification clause. Very, very simple document. Now, in the four branches of government, we're told that the power is divided among two distinct governments, and they control each other as a double security. Well, I want you to think with me for a second the last time you rode a bicycle. Some of you, it may be yesterday, some of you, it may have been a while. But think about the last time you rode a bicycle, and think about those two wheels on the bicycle. You've got the front tire and you've got the back tire, and so imagine that the front tire of the bicycle is just extremely bloated. You remember when you've ridden your bike and it's got that bubble in it and it bumps every time you ride? Well, imagine that whole front tire is just tremendously bloated. It's about to explode. And then you've got the back tire, and the back tire is so flat that it's just riding on the rim. It's chewing up the rubber as you go. And so you've got these two tires. You've got the one that's really bloated and the other one's flat, right? You got that picture in your mind? Now, with your bicycle, your object is to get to a particular destination. You're trying to go somewhere. Now, how many of you would suppose that on that bicycle, the answer to getting where you want to go is to get a new rider? Maybe you have Lance Armstrong all hopped up on steroids, and that's how you're going to get where you want to go. Well, of course not, right? Of course that's not the answer. Well, how many of you would think that the answer is to maybe change the destination a little bit? Maybe we go a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right. Is that the answer of getting our bicycle active and moving? Of course not, right? The answer is we've got to fix the bicycle. We've got to fix this back tire. We've got to inflate that one, and this front tire that's so bloated, we've got to get them back to where they're in balance. Well, that's our constitutional system. It's called a federal system of government, where the power is divided among state and national governments, and two governments control each other for a very specific purpose: to protect the liberty of the individuals. That was the purpose of our system. Two governments, not one, that control each other as a double security to the rights of the people. Now, if you think back on the Declaration of Independence, it tells us the very purpose of our government. First off, it says that all men are created equal. They're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, that means we have an exit interview. It matters what we do. We are going to account for what we do with our unalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And pursuit of happiness, of course, meant property and the right to govern ourselves and determine our own destiny. So life, liberty, property, the ability to determine our own destiny. Then it says to secure these rights, governments exist among men. To secure the rights of liberty, property, govern ourselves, governments exist, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It's important to understand who is the boss in our system the way it was designed. We're the boss, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But if we want to be treated like the boss, we have to act like the boss. If you're running a company and you don't act like the boss, well, nobody's going to treat you like the boss. That's critical in our system. But think of what that means. We're the boss. We are, in this year, out to hire and inspire leaders who understand that their job, their number one job, is to secure life, our liberty, our right and control of property, and our ability to determine our own destiny. And that's their job. And so as we're out as the boss hiring leaders this year more than ever, we need to make sure that we're not hiring people who have cool hair or can give a nice speech. We need to hire people who understand that their job is to secure our rights. Very critical. Now let's take that to our property. So we have a Supreme Court just from Utah back in the early 1900s. His name was George Sutherland. George Sutherland made this statement. He said, man has three great rights: life, liberty, property. They're so interconnected as to be a single right. If you give a man his life, but take away his liberty, you take away all that makes life worth living. If you give him his liberty, but you take from him the property, which is the fruit and the badge of his liberty, you still leave him a slave. Property is the essence of our liberty. Property is the essence of our liberty. It's the essence of why government exists. Does it make sense at all that in the United States of America that exists to secure property and our ability to govern ourselves, that this would be considered fair and equal in any way? Well, it's not, and it doesn't make sense because it's not in line, it's not in harmony with who we say we are. Think about it for a second. Think about why people settled the West. Why did they go west? Very simple. I can tell you my ancestors that came to Utah, and the story is very similar for all throughout the West. My ancestors came to Utah because they wanted to find somewhere that no one else wanted. They came to Utah, and it was a desert. In fact, there wasn't a single tree in the Salt Lake Valley when they got here. Jim Bridger bet Brigham Young $20 that he would never grow a bushel of corn in the Salt Lake Valley, and they said, great. Give us that piece of land that no one else wants, and leave us alone. Let us govern ourselves. Let us determine our own destiny. Let us pass opportunity on to our children, and we'll make that desert blossom as a rose. And they did. And imagine that there are people now who say that we can't govern our land. We can't take care of our own land. That's patently offensive. It's absurd to think about those that came here. Let me tell you just another story, and again, it would be very similar throughout the West. Those who came to Utah came in wagons. I have an ancestor that wrote in his journal, he said he was in St. Louis, and his journal simply says, walked to the Salt Lake Valley without incident. Walked from St. Louis to the Salt Lake Valley to get here, to have a piece of land that no one else wanted so that he could govern his own destiny with a piece of land and provide opportunities to his children. Now, some of them were not nearly as fortunate as my ancestor. Some of them along the way were in wagons. Some were pulling handcarts. Some went through snow and very treacherous conditions. In fact, as they were coming, they had 8 ounces of flour was their daily ration of food to get to this piece of land that no one else wanted. 8 ounces was their daily ration of food. As they were coming west, they discovered that their strongest men in those treacherous conditions were falling dead along the wayside. Their strongest men. It was a very serious situation. The captain of the company sent out an investigation to learn why their strongest men were dropping dead along the wayside. And what they discovered was that their strongest men were taking their 8 ounces of flour and they were scooping it into their children's pouch so they would survive and make it to that valley that no one else wanted and have that property and the ability to govern themselves and have that opportunity going forward. That's the nature of the people that settled West and why they settled the West and how it came to be that we're here in the West. And yet we have people that say we can't manage our own land. I would submit to you that is absolutely absurd on its face. So let's drill back and think for just a second. We all want healthy air, water, wildlife, don't we? We all want safe and vibrant communities. We all want abundant recreation, right? Does anyone not want those things? I don't know anyone that doesn't, right? We all want those things, but we've been told for decades now that the only way we get those objectives, the only way we get those things is to have federal bureaucrats thousands of miles away manage our lands for us. Now, they lock our lands up, almost like they're in a museum, right? They lock it up, throw away the key. Hands off, don't touch. You know what's in a museum, right? Dead and dusty things. That's what you find in a museum. So what we're seeing from this distant control of our lands, where they're locked up, hands off, don't touch, we're seeing forests that are growing out of control. And because the forests are growing out of control, they're now dead and dying all over the West. They're burning by the millions, record-setting wildfires almost every year. We certainly don't have to tell that to our friends in Oregon and Washington, do we? But all over the West, Alaska, throughout Arizona. Arizona's had record wildfires. Idaho, record wildfires. California, record wildfires. We're seeing that all over. Well, why is that happening? I had a county commissioner in Idaho tell me an example that stuck with me. He said, imagine that you have a pen that holds 50 cows, and you have food for 50 cows, you have water for 50 cows, but you decide you're going to put 1,000 cows in that pen and walk away. Imagine what's going to happen. They're going to get sick, they're going to die. Well, in the West, we have forests that can be sustained indefinitely at about 50 to 100 trees per acre. They have enough sunlight and water and nutrients for 50 to 100 trees per acre. They can survive indefinitely at 50 to 100 trees per acre. But when you put 6 or 7 or 800 or 1,000 trees per acre, they're fighting for the same water, for the same nutrients, for the same sunlight, and they're getting sick and they're dying all over the West. Normally, they would fend off the pests naturally. They would fend off diseases naturally, but they're so stressed that they're dying all over the West. I mean, imagine you've got your Diet Coke in front of you, and instead of you drinking the Diet Coke yourself, you have 100 straws, and other people are fighting with you with their 100 in your Diet Coke to drink it as fast as they can. Well, we have forested acres that have 1,000 straws in them, sucking up that water as fast as they can. In fact, the University of California, Merced scientists just last summer concluded a study that said if they just harvested the Sierra Nevadas to the sustainable tree density, they would conserve substantially more than 250 billion gallons of water a year. More than enough water for 2 million families a year in drought-stricken California. And oh, by the way, they would have a healthier forest. They would have funding for education, funding for public safety. They wouldn't be burning up animals. They wouldn't be destroying watershed. And yet under federal management, they lock up like it's in a museum, throw away the key, hands off, don't touch. We're getting polluted air. We're getting burned down forest and animals, destroyed watershed. Now the communities, we talk about we want safe and vibrant communities as well. Josephine County, Oregon, many of you know this story. This was on NPR, Fox News, 18 months, 2 years ago. Josephine County has some of the most productive forests in the nation. In fact, I stayed at Sheriff Gertson's house, The sheriff's office, the sheriff on their patch, they have a logging truck on their patch because from harvesting the timber, they kept a healthy forest and they had funding for public safety and they had funding for education. Well, along comes the federal bureaucrats that say you can't harvest any trees. They shut everything down. Now you have the overgrown forest that is dying everywhere you go, but you don't have funding for education. You don't have funding for public safety. In that situation, a woman calls 911 and she says, help, can you please send someone out? Someone is beating down my door. The 911 operator actually tells her, I'm sorry, the sheriff only operates from 9 to 5. Can you ask him to go away? She says, I already did that. She said, can you call back tomorrow? We don't have anyone that can come out today. They only operate from 9 to 5. Can you call tomorrow? And the woman was raped and brutalized in her own home because the sheriff's department is completely understaffed. Education, understaffed. They have what used to be some of the best funded schools in the nation. Now most of their kids are on free and reduced lunch. They're laying off people all over the county. They don't even have the viability now. They just shut down the last mill. They used to have 53 mills in Josephine County that provided good paying jobs. You could walk into Josephine County and get a job the day you arrive. The last of the mills just shut down just recently. Their community is dying. Garfield County, you just declared an economic state of emergency. President Clinton declared the 2 million acre monument in 1996, 3 weeks before the election, shut down $2 trillion worth of the world's cleanest burning coal. Following that, they shut down timber harvesting, grazing, mining, and families started leaving in droves. The school district went to the counties and said, we're down from 157 through 12 students down to 50. If we lose any more students, our school will close and no one will want to live in this ghost county. They declared it an economic state of emergency because of what's happening on this museum management of our lands. Recreation being closed down all over the West. In fact, you can't make this up. In the fire that you had in Washington, and this has happened in Oregon and throughout, there was an article that the Forest Service is actually going in after shutting down roads all over the West as the fires are raging through the western states. They're going in and paying money to reopen the roads to be able to fight the fires and put in fire breaks from the roads they already shut down. This is happening all over the West. We've, in Montana, related to the fire issue, Montana has some of the most elite firefighting crews in the nation, if not the world. They put out fires on average at less than 10 acres. They've equipped helicopters to carry more water faster than anyone else. Last August, as the fires are raging off the overgrown, catastrophic federal forests, 5 crews of Montana firefighters are in their helicopters in the air. They see the lightning strikes and the plume of smoke. They're en route to put out the fires as they do at less than 10 acres, and they're radioed from the U.S. Forest Service to stand down because, according to the Forest Service, the Montana helicopters are not on the Forest Service approved list. And they ordered them to stand down and watch as thousands and thousands and thousands of acres burned, wildlife incinerated, air polluted for weeks, watershed destroyed for decades. This is what we're seeing with the museum management of federal bureaucrats thousands of miles away. It's simply not working. We have to free the lands for more effective local care and management. We have to free the lands so that those who know the lands best, whose lives and livelihoods depend upon the lands, can better care for them, and then we get healthy air, water, wildlife. Then we get safe and vibrant communities. Then we get abundant recreational opportunities. Now let's talk about how that happens. Many people have said when I ran the bill, we had a law professor at the University of Utah who was fond of pronouncing boldly that it's clearly unconstitutional. Imagine that. It's clearly unconstitutional for us to think that we could be treated equally in the western states. And he made this claim boldly, and of course the Salt Lake Tribune was eager to publish his claim at every chance they got. No one ever bothered to ask him, well, why do you say that it's unequal, or why do you say, excuse me, it's unconstitutional for the Western states to be treated equally and fairly? Well, he never answered that question until after the legislative session when I passed the Transfer of Public Lands Act. I was on a continuing legal education panel with this professor from the University of Utah. And so I was excited to ask him, well, Professor, why do you say that it's unconstitutional for us to control our own lands? And I didn't even have to ask the question because he went first. So he gets up and he puts up a map that shows the annual average rainfall in the lower 48 states, the average precipitation for the lower 48. And he says, you see how it's different in the West than it is in the East? You see how it's different in the West? The color is different. Well, therefore, the federal government controls the land. Therefore, the federal government controls the land. Your land is arid. Now, mind you, I've never seen the arid clause in the Constitution. Your land is dry, it's arid. Well, think about that for just a second, even on its face. Alaska has more than 1 million lakes and 700,000 people, and the federal government controls 62% of Alaska. Oregon, arid, and yet the federal government controls 53% of Oregon. Washington, northern Idaho. And then what is the distinction of arid versus not arid that allows the federal government to subjectively say, we control your land? Now, how ridiculous, but I would submit how ridiculous that we've not asked the question for decades to realize the very untenable basis that they're claiming for keeping us unequal and from controlling our own destiny. Now, the second reason he gave was even as silly as the first. He says, I've looked at the enabling acts, the statehood agreements of all the Western states, and they all have the same language. The people forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated lands. They just gave up the lands at statehood. You gave up the lands. You have no claim to it. Now, first of all, he's only reading half a sentence. The rest of the sentence says, forever disclaim all right and title until title thereto shall have been extinguished. You see, he didn't bother to look east of the Rockies, and most all of the states east of the Rockies have the exact same terms or similar terms that have the same meaning in their statehood agreements as well. You see, the states all, the newly created states all, gave clean title to the federal government as a trustee so they could dispose of the land more quickly and for the most amount of money possible at statehood. All the states east and west of the Rockies have the exact same terms of statehood. But think about his argument from the standpoint of the Western states. What he's saying is that those people that came west and sacrificed everything to come west so they could have a piece of land that no one else wanted, to have liberty, to control their own destiny, he's claiming that their very first act of statehood was to give up all their land. Doesn't make any sense at all. And yet they make these arguments with a straight face, and until recently, we've not even been challenging them. Now there are good people like you, people all over the West, people all over the nation, that are saying, this is absolutely ridiculous on its face, and challenging it. And then their third argument we've touched on already. Their third argument as to why we can't be treated equally and fairly is because the uncouth people in the West can't control their own land. Think of how patently offensive that is. Those that came here to a desert that no one else wanted and have made this desert blossom, their argument is that we can't manage our own lands. Well, I will tell you that it wouldn't be hard to beat federal museum management. It's hard to beat an F grade, is it? The Property and Environmental Research Center out of Bozeman, Montana, it's called PERC. You can look up this report at PERC, PERC.org. Last year, PERC came out with a study that studied federal versus state management of public lands. What they discovered was that they said, by all accounts, federal lands are in trouble, both in terms of economic performance and environmental stewardship. They said that for every dollar the federal government spends managing public lands, it loses 27 cents. And they're acquiring more land all the time. I think maybe they're trying to make it up by volume, this substantial loss. For every dollar the federal government spends, it loses 27 cents. To the contrary, for every dollar the states spend managing public lands, they generate on average $14.51 positive net revenue. And if we could pull up the screen, I could show you photo after photo after photo of fence lines of forested lands, where on one side of the fence you've got federally controlled land that is in disastrous circumstances, and on the other side of the fence you have a forest that is healthy and vibrant. In fact, in Arizona, when they had the Wallow Fire, on the Apache Sitgraves National Forest, the fire broke out right near the boundary of the National Forest and the Apache Tribal Forest. 500,000 acres of the federal forest barely singes into the Apache Forest because they've actually actively managed the forest. And in an active managed forest, the fire drops to the ground. It's a ground fire that is healthy, that burns up the understory. It doesn't get into the crown of the trees and devastate everything and destroy the watershed for decades. The fire happens right on the border. And that's happening all over the West. In fact, I was in Oregon just after the fires that they had there. Went up into the mountains. The fire had been put out just weeks earlier. And on the left side of the road, where they had actively managed, there would maybe be 5% tree mortality. The fire was a ground fire, burned itself out. On the right side of the road, they had done no management. The federal government had done no management of the forest, and the forest was blackened and devastated, 99% tree mortality. This is happening all over the West. If you think about it simply, you think about it just very simply. I love to make spaghetti sauce. I make the best spaghetti sauce in the world. Of course, you have to have homegrown basil. Garlic is critical. Lots and lots of garlic, right? And you get Italian. You get the Italian sweet sausage and the Italian spicy sausage, and you mix those together. And key ingredient, you get the Parmesan cheese, and you grate the Parmesan cheese right into the sauce, so it simmers into the sauce. It's wonderful. But the critical ingredient is, I walk right out my back door, I walk to my garden, and I pick the tomatoes right off the vine. I pick them right off the vine, I stew them up into the sauce and simmer it all in. It's the best spaghetti sauce in the world. Now, how many of you have your own gardens? How many of you think that someone from New Jersey, thousands of miles away, could manage your garden with a book on gardening from New Jersey better than you can? Think about it. Now imagine you've got a garden that you only manage every other square foot in the garden, and you've got a manager who doesn't care for their land, that's managing a checkerboard around your garden, and you only take little pieces of it. Similar situation. It's absolutely absurd to think that someone could manage your unique garden spot, your unique soil and climate and pests and conditions, and be there for any unforeseen circumstances from thousands of miles away with a book on gardening. But that's exactly what's happening to our unique Western lands. We have bureaucrats in Washington that have policies, their management by litigation, analysis paralysis, and as a result, we're seeing record-setting wildfires. We're seeing roads closed off. We're seeing communities dwindling on the vine. It's very critical. Now let's talk about how we got into this situation in the first place. It's actually a very fascinating story. I've been asked to speak at CPAC. I'll be there next Saturday, speaking at CPAC in Washington, D.C. It's actually being held in Maryland. This public land story actually started with Maryland in 1776. They declare independence, and Maryland says, hey guys, we're going to have to fund this war. And there are some of you states that have western lands. They called them the western wastelands. They said, we need to put that land in trust to fund this war. Because if we're all going to be putting our effort into the war, and at the end of the day, some of you will be these big landed states, and we're landlocked, and we'll be in an unequal partnership with the rest of you. Now, in 1776, they did not solve the problem. They declared independence, but as they were going forward, they got to 1780, and in 1780, they're still in the middle of the war, and they're nearly broke. I mean, you think we have problems. They've taken on the most powerful, well-trained army in the world, and they're nearly out of money. They had begun to start forming the Articles of Confederation, but Maryland continued to say, we're not going to join this confederation until we solve this Western land question. They called it the question of the age. It was the great embarrassment. They finally got together, and the Continental, or the Congress got together, and they proposed a resolution that said, be it resolved that the unappropriated lands of the West that will be ceded to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit. That meant to pay the debt of the war, and shall be formed into distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as all the other states. On that basis, New York was the first state to cede their lands to their union of states in trust to pay the debt of the war, create distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Equal states. Virginia was the next to cede their lands. Virginia actually said in their deed of cession that they are ceding the lands for those purposes, the common fund to pay the debt of the war, and they said that the lands shall be faithfully and bona fide disposed of for that purpose and no other use or purpose whatsoever. The rest of the 7 states eventually ceded all of their lands in trust as well. And that's where we get the provision of the Constitution in Article 4. Now remember, Article 1, Congress, Article 2, President, Article 3, courts, Article 4, rights of and obligations to the states. In Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, the rights of and obligations to the states, not the powers of Congress, except to fulfill its obligations to the states, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 states, Congress shall have the power to dispose of, not keep the lands forever and ever and ever. Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make needful rules and regulations for disposing of the land. And nothing in the Constitution shall prejudice any claims of the United States or of the particular states. Remember back to 1780 when they were in the middle of the war and they had this great question of what they were going to do, and Maryland was holding out and said it wasn't going to join the Confederacy until they agreed that the states would be treated equally? Those were the claims that Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution references. Now, when they finally agreed to the conditions that Maryland wouldn't join the Articles of Confederation unless they did agree, they finalized the Articles of Confederation. France then was waiting for them to be able to organize themselves. France then loaned them money. Within months after that, they had fought the final battles and won the Revolutionary War. This question is fundamental to the very birth of our nation. So now at the Constitutional Convention, they're discussing the very same thing. They said, okay, these Western lands, we will have new states in the Western lands, and that was part of the debate in Article 4. And they said, do we really want to allow those savages in the West, in states like Illinois and Missouri and Florida and Michigan, do we want to allow those savages in the West to participate with us on an equal footing in the halls of Congress, in the representation of the new government? And they had the debate. Should we allow those Western states to be treated equally? And in the debate, they said, our system, of a union of states will not work unless states are treated equally, unless they're on an equal footing, equal sovereignty, the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, independence as all the other states. And on that basis, they ratified the Constitution. Well, as Washington said, it's the nature of man. The love of power predominates in the heart of men. And as the nation moved forward and they started moving west, they started disposing of the lands. They came to a point where they simply stopped disposing of the land. And for decades, states in the West were more than 90% federally controlled. And the states began to complain to Congress. They began to send resolutions and band together and say, this isn't fair. You're not disposing of our land. We can't educate our kids and grow our economy. We can't determine our own destiny according to our own views of happiness and prosperity. And they got together and they battled and they compelled Congress to transfer their lands on terms of equality. Those western states, Michigan and Indiana and Ohio and Iowa and Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi, and of course, you know that great western state of Florida. Florida used to send resolutions. Its legislature sent resolutions to Congress repeatedly. He said, we're the worst off of all the western states, the Florida legislature used to say. You're not disposing of our land. We can't educate our children. Our people are leaving our state for opportunities elsewhere. Those states banded together. They compelled Congress to transfer their lands. In fact, they were led by a gentleman named Thomas Hart Benton. He was a Democrat senator from Missouri. In Oregon, a county named Benton County, Oregon. It's named after Thomas Hart Benton. John F. Kennedy, in his book, Courage, he named the 8 greatest senators in United States history. One of them, Thomas Hart Benton. Teddy Roosevelt wrote a biography of Thomas Hart Benton. In it, he said, Benton's view of liberal disposition of the lands was undoubtedly the correct one. He never gave up the fight, even though he was repulsed by the short-sighted selfishness of the Northeasterners. Now, here's what Thomas Hart Benton had to say. Thomas Hart Benton said, my election to the Senate of the United States found me doing battle for changing this system of disposing of the public lands. He says, I resolved to move against the whole system. He said, I did so in a bill that he ran every year, but more so in speeches to the public. Remember who the boss is? He writes boss and speeches to the public on the nature of being treated equally and fairly in the disposition of land. He said the federal government was like a monopolizer of the vacant lands of the West, and like all monopolies, it results in a hardship to the vacant lands of the West, right? Illinois, Missouri, Florida. And he gave this charge that I think is the charge that we need to make sure that we have to the people we elect now. He gave this charge. He says, you members of Congress, you leaders, and I would submit every leader that we elect, everyone that we hire in this election year, we need to make sure they understand this charge. He says, you members of Congress need to fix your eyes steadily on the period of the speedy extinction of the federal title lands in the West. And they did. And they did. Now, I'll tell you a quick story. Pam, we've spoken in Washington repeatedly. We'll be back there in a couple of weeks. We've met with individuals, county commissioners, party leaders, state representatives, state senators, staff for members of Congress, and have had opportunities to speak with these people. But you all have begun sharing. You've gotten on the American Lands Council website. There's now an organization called Federalism in Action, Free the Lands Project. And so freethelands.org, freethelands, I think .com, you can get there as well, but free the you can get there, and then also AmericanLandsCouncil.org. You can get information and share the information. Lands Council Facebook page. There's a Facebook page, an ALC Facebook page for state. You can get on and get information and share the information. Well, because people in Washington and sharing critical fundamental rights, liberty, property, self-determination, with all of them that they exercise knowledge and courage. When I was in Washington, D.C. last June, I had a meeting with one of your members of Congress. Never met this member before, but when they called, someone actually knew. They called and set the appointment up for me to go meet our member of Congress. They broke out in the middle of a very, very busy schedule, broke out 40 5 minutes. Some people will say, oh, but it will be hard to manage our own lands, to govern ourselves, and indeed it will be. There are a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues to deal with. There are a lot of questions in governing ourselves and managing our own lands. It will indeed be hard to govern ourselves, but I will submit to you that it will be infinitely harder if we choose not to govern ourselves. That's the very nature of our system. It depends upon us taking the responsibility to govern ourselves. I'll leave you with a simple promise. I believe it is a promise. It was the words of encouragement by Ronald Reagan in 1987, height of the Cold War, the red phones, the nuclear proliferation. And he made this statement that I think is as compelling for us today, and if he were here, I believe he would say the very same thing. This is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness, and I would add, for property, which is the essence of our liberty. And he said, these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, out to seize back a country and a world to freedom. Appreciate your time. Please, any questions, happy to answer any questions you might have as we go through.
Thank you so much, Representative Ivory. That was great. The only question that I've seen so far in the chat box was, what year were the lands transferred when you were speaking of Illinois, Missouri, Florida?
So in 1854, they passed a federal bill called the Graduation Act, and that reduced the price, and then ultimately, if no one would buy them, they would simply give them to the states, to Michigan, to Kentucky, to Tennessee, to Texas, to Hawaii. They gave all the lands outright to the state. Michigan, they gave them 13 million acres. Others were sold, but Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Hawaii, they gave the lands outright. Hawaii was in 1959. In their Enabling Act, it says the federal government hereby grants to the Hawaii all the public lands, title which is held by the United States immediately prior to their admission. So, and those promises are exactly the same. I would encourage you to get to that legal analysis. So at the American Lands Council site, there's a resources tab. And at the bottom of the resources tab, it says TPL blog or TPL legal analysis blog. And you can get an executive summary of the legal analysis. You can link through to the full legal analysis. It's about 146 pages. Very detailed on the history, very detailed on the law, the legal claims. We need to get that in front of all of our leaders. And very simple questions. Why the difference? Why are we tolerating this?
Next question. Can you recommend a good basic book on this history that you're speaking of?
Yes, go to the legal analysis. The first, it's covered quite well in the first 12 pages of the summary, but then if you go through probably the first 30 to 40 pages of the legal analysis, gives a phenomenal treatment on the history. And you'll really get the sense, that our nation was founded on the equality of people and the equality of the states. In fact, in the legal analysis, they cite a case from 2013, Supreme Court case 2013, that says, it quotes a 150-year line of Supreme Court cases, but it says, the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the republic. Our nation was and is a union of states equal in power, dignity, and authority. Think about that. our very union, our republic, does not function in harmony, in peace, without an equality of the states. That's exactly what we're seeing all over the West. And until we get back into harmony with who we say we are, we're not going to see the peace and the prosperity and the harmony. The Supreme Court recognized that as late as 2 years ago.
Next question. How do we get our legislatures to listen?
Leverage. Leverage. You take your one voice and you turn your one voice into 10. 10 people with a state legislator is like an army. If you commit that you're going to, if they do the right thing, you will stand up for them. You'll work for them. You'll make phone calls for them. You'll send letters to them. You'll encourage and tell everyone you know. If you have 10 people that are mobilized, willing to help that representative, they'll walk through fire for you. Now, then you get your county commissioners, and county commissioner, representative, sheriff, state senator, and then build your way up to Congress. You build your leverage. There's also, I believe, on the website, one of the things that I'll follow up, Pam, if you'll send me an email, I'll send you a coalition letter. And the coalition letter we put together when we were back in D.C., we spoke at the Heritage Foundation and did a big program at the Heritage Foundation a month ago. That's also on the website. That's another thing that you'll want to look at, and it's a really good thing to share. But the coalition letter on a front and back one page gives a really good treatment of the history, the basic law, the basic foundation of this claim in front and back one page. And so I'll send that to you. We'll make sure that's on the website and get that out to everyone as well. But leverage, you get your counties, you get your school districts, you get your state representatives and others signing on to this coalition letter, and you keep building that leverage as you move up the chain, and as you're going to your members of Congress, your governors, your attorney generals, as you have hundreds and thousands, and particularly where you have individuals that represent thousands and tens of thousands signing on to the coalition letter, now you're showing leverage, you're showing force. But the real key is this is a participatory sport. If we're going to be treated like the boss, we have to act like the boss and be in the game. But this is entirely up to us. And it is happening all over the West. People are telling this story. They're moving all over on this.
Kit asks, is the EPA basically behind the federal unwillingness to transfer lands?
I think there are a number of people that are concerned about our liberty. They see our liberty and our freedom and our ability to determine our own destiny as a threat to their control and their power. So the environmental extremist groups that now have the agencies completely tied up in litigation and they control the land, they feel threatened, and oh my gosh, they are wailing, gnashing their teeth. They are going crazy with all sorts of nonsense and publishing all sorts of crazy articles because they're afraid of losing their power. They're afraid that our freedom undermines their control. We have an organization in Washington, D.C. funded by George Soros. They have millions of dollars funded just to attack what we're doing. They feel so threatened by what we're doing. So, yeah, there are people that are afraid that if they do not control our land, they cannot control us as a people. The corollary to that is, when we control our own land, we control our own destiny. But until we control our own land, we will be like slaves, like George Sutherland said.
Yes, I find it interesting. I got a link from John Rice about this headwaterseconomics.org website that says federal lands in the West, liability or asset. And they basically contradict what you have been saying that Western rural counties and have economically benefited in 4 different categories: faster employment or faster population, employment, personal income, and per capita income growth from 1970 to 2014, which for those of us that live in the Western states know that that's a bunch of inaccurate information, to put it politely. But I assume you're getting probably a lot of that.
Yeah, they would make George Orwell blush.
Yes,
it's so ridiculous. All you need to do is call any county commissioner throughout the West and say, hey, are you better off with the federal government controlling your land? And yet they publish these things and try to just bludgeon people with the sheer volume that they put out. It's absolutely patently ridiculous.
So Barbara Ames from New Jersey asks, what can the eastern states do to help?
Barbara, great question. The eastern states are going to be critical. They're going to be absolutely critical. So one of the things that you can do, and I'm going for the question, Tennessee this year passed a resolution supporting the transfer of lands. South Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, along with Tennessee, have passed resolutions supporting the transfer of public lands. For their own selfish interests, if we do not have an equality of states, the western states can be held hostage anytime the federal government wants to grow to your detriment. And so we start working with your state representatives, we start working with your party leadership and others, we start getting resolutions from smaller to larger organizations, and then getting your state to the point that they understand we're burning millions of acres, we're destroying watershed, we're sucking up water just to burn it off into the air, we're burning up millions of animals. This is an environmental nightmare, let alone an economic opportunity that is just being squandered, and a constitutional degradation. And so as we get that message out, I mean, think about this for a second, okay? The study said that, while the federal government is losing money, the states make money. Only in the federal government hands is property considered a liability. To everyone else, it's the ultimate asset, right? And so in addition to the things we've talked about, just from better environment, better economic, from local control, the Government Accountability Office, about 3 years ago, testifying to Congress, said there is more recoverable oil in just Utah, Colorado, Wyoming than the rest of the world combined. Institute for Energy Research said there's more than $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the federally controlled lands. By unleashing the opportunity to balance environmental care and quality with economic productivity, with access to the lands, and striking that balance by those who are on the lands, who know the lands best, whose lives depend upon the lands, we end up with win-win-win instead of under federal museum management, poor health, poor access, and devastated, depressed productivity. So when the western states be held hostage, they hold the whole system hostage to your detriment in the eastern states. Those resolutions are critical. On the American Lands Council website under resources, you can find the resolutions passed by many of those states. The Republican National Committee did a resolution supporting the transfer of public lands a year or two ago. The more organizations that we get, national organizations that pass similar resolutions, sign on to that coalition letter, the more we start building that leverage.
So Howard has a question. When is Utah going to present their case for the court? What court level will you go to?
Great question. So in a case that came out of Oklahoma in 1911, it makes clear that there's original jurisdiction to the Supreme Court to bring a case based on the enabling act of a state. So we have our legal team working on that analysis now. They're preparing a complaint now that once our legislative session is over, we'll have our commission reconvene and look at the complaint that they've prepared, the legal strategy that they've prepared. Our legislature in this legislative session will, in all likelihood, appropriate several $1 million to move forward on the litigation. And then at that point, it really is up to our governor and our attorney general. The legislature doesn't bring suit in Utah. That's the governor and the attorney general. And so we have to make sure that we have encouragement and pressure and leverage to our governor and our attorney general as well. In all likelihood, there's a number of factors. To the extent that we see an arbitrary, non-consensual monument designation in Utah this year by the president, I would submit that all bets are off. We would maybe start moving as fast as we can at that point. Likely within a year. However, the death of Justice Scalia raises some concerns that we're still sorting our way through. We need to see where the court sorts out at this point as well. I would mention that we're also working with Senator Lee's office and others on Congressman Amodei from Nevada, a number of others on transfer of public land, transition of public land legislation at federal level. And so once we get that ready, work that out, and we need to get everyone behind that. We need to get co-sponsors to it. We need to drive our members of Congress, get them educated so that they will support federal legislation. Because at the end of the day, the Constitution says that Congress has the power to dispose of the land. So even a court decision in our favor would be directing Congress to do their job, keep the same promises, honor the same constitutional obligations on both sides of the Rockies.
Barbara asked the question, since this policy change in 1976, she says Carter, is this...
It was actually Ford.
Ford, okay.
It was actually Ford who signed it. Yeah, so I don't know anything specific to that. What we do know is they're locking up lands, locking up resources, taking people off the land, and the greatest thing that we can do to stand against all sorts of movements like that is to get back to our fundamental principles: liberty, property, self-determination. And the more there are forces within the United States and outside of the United States that are trying to take away the very foundational promises of America, they're mobilized, they're motivated, they have an incentive to do that. It's time for us to become re-incentivized with our liberty, with our self-determination and our right of property. Again, like Reagan said, these are things worth fighting for because there are people on another team that are fighting to take them away from us.
So Bill Ames from New Jersey is asking, are the feds using mineral rights as collateral for federal debt?
It's a great question. That's a question that we need to get to every member of Congress and make them put that to the agencies, put that to the department heads specifically. We know that Hillary Clinton, it was reported as Secretary of State, she gave away 20% of the nation's uranium to a company that was established by a number of Russian interests. 20% of the nation's uranium sold off to Russian interests. We also know that in South American countries, I believe it was Ecuador, that China went in, and because Ecuador was not paying their debts, they said, you need to sell this land or give us the land to cover the debt payments. That was, I believe, a UK Guardian story from a year and a half ago or so. Nations that we owe a lot of money to, whether there's an express or implied pledge, the fact that we owe them money and we have this resource is not lost on them. So we need to make sure that we stake the claim, that the federal government knows it's nothing more than a trustee. It doesn't have a right to sell the asset and go book the cruise and pay their debts. That property is being held in trust for us, for our citizens, for the future, and the future progress and happiness of our states. If we don't stake that claim, who knows what a $20 trillion indebted nation will do. We know that desperate debtors do desperate deeds. And we have the most desperately indebted nation in the history of the world right now.
Sandy would like to know how Hillary had the authority to do that.
Well, that's a great question. That is a tremendously great question. I don't know the answer. There is, and I think, quite honestly, what's happening at this point is because no one is asking the question. They're simply doing it because there's no defense. When we don't understand, remember we talked about the bicycle, when we don't understand the difference between the front tire and the back tire and which one does what, the federal government is simply going to occupy anything that's not opposed. They're doing it with law enforcement. They're now trying to take over water, the Clean Power Plan that was just passed by regulatory fiat. They're taking over anything that we're not defending and protecting in terms of jurisdiction. And so it's critical that we understand that jurisdiction and assert and defend. That's why who we elect matters. Who we elect as county commissioners, who we elect as sheriffs, as state representatives, governors, it matters that we are actively in the game, acting like the boss.
Hey, Karen. Karen,
Yeah.
can you hear? Go ahead and speak, Karen. I'm gonna hold your. I've got Karen on my home phone line. She's gonna speak, and hopefully you can hear her. Ken, has a comment. Go ahead.
Yes, I had been reading articles on that Russian deal. What I had read is that Russia contributed to the Clinton Foundation while Hillary was Secretary of State. And it was during her time as Secretary of State that that deal was transacted.
Yeah. Yeah. I've read the same, I've read the same things. I mean, it's extremely distressing, and yet if we don't have members of Congress, governors, attorneys general that can take the executive action to sue, to defend, to stake the claim, they simply get away with it by the lack of opposition. No, as we're talking, it occurs to me that that's something we need to elevate up the chain. But see, right now, the Supreme Court case law is somewhat settled in the sense that while the federal government is the manager of the land, which was supposed to be temporary, they are the manager. But to sell off those rights permanently to Russia, that's something that we need to look into how to escalate up the chain. And this call is getting my wheels spinning as to what I can do as a state legislator to start looking into that as well.
So that was a arrangement.
Say that again, Karen.
So that was a permanent arrangement?
That's how I read it. I don't know the details of it, but while we're talking, I'm gonna send a text to some of my legislative staff to find out about this. You're spurring a bunch of questions for me to start looking into this. Now, again, at the federal level, we really need our members of Congress to start drilling down, and I'll send word out to Mike Lee and have him look into that as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen.
China asked the question earlier. Are these foreign nations coming in to hedge, or not hedge, but to collect on a debt owed by gaining access to our mineral rights? China is definitely trying to do that.
I didn't hear all the question. Something about the nations that we owe money to trying to get access to our mineral rights. Is that?
Yeah, basically, she's referring to China.
Yeah. Well, think about it, guys. I mean, if I used to work for the mayor of the city of Osaka in Japan. I was in the international relations department. with the city of Osaka back in the mid to late 80s. And when I was there, they used to say repeatedly, you Americans don't realize what you have. You have everything. Japan is a nation about the size of California that has the Rocky Mountains running through it and 125 million people. And they have no resources. He said, you have everything. Well, why then would a nation that is so richly blessed with abundant resources, why would we burn our forests rather than use them in a renewable fashion that provides a healthier forest, healthier habitat, healthier for wildlife and access, and be able to fund education, public safety, and community services? Why would a sane, rational nation do that? Why would a sane, rational nation be dependent upon foreign powers that frankly don't like us? Why would a sane nation be dependent on China for 90% of the rare earth elements that it takes to run all of our electronics equipment, all of our military technology? We rely 90% on China for earth elements, and they're locked up from New Mexico to Alaska. Why would a sane, rational nation do that? I would submit that wars are fought economically before they're ever fought with bombs and bullets. China has made statements, Russia has made statements, others have made statements that in an economic war, they engage in cultural destabilization, economic influence. You look at the organizations and others that are shutting down our self-reliance, our self-determination, our ability to better care for the land. What they're doing is destroying the environment that they claim to be protecting. It's running people off the lands and depressing communities. I would submit that perhaps this is one of the greatest battles of economic warfare and cultural destabilization we've ever seen in the history of the world.
Howard states, I realize each state has to file suit to get control of their lands. If Utah is successful first, how will this help the other Western states?
Yeah, I think as we set the stage, let me say first of all, we've just passed the House legislation that opens up a restricted fund for others, individuals, organizations, other states, to contribute in to the restricted account to fund the litigation. To the extent that we prevail, we resolve the questions for all the other states that are willing to take control and management of their own lands.
Okay, let me move this down. Matt Winey asks, do we know which presidential candidates are for transferring the lands back to the states?
All of them so far except Donald Trump. Donald Trump made a statement about 3 weeks ago that he was at a hunting, fishing type expo, and he said, we want to keep these lands great, and we don't want to give them to the states because we don't want them sold off, and we don't know what the states will do with them. Now, mind you, the only people talking about selling the lands are the environmental extremists that want to continue to maintain their stranglehold, and so they're running ads and saying, oh, the states would sell off all the lands. That's absurd for a number of reasons. In the Enabling Act and also in my bill, if we sell the land, 95% of the proceeds go to the federal government to pay the national debt. Why would we sell lands that we get no benefit for? Why would you chop down a tree for firewood when you can have the apples forever? Why would you kill the goose when you can have the golden eggs forever? States managing and leasing and looking at user fees and access fees on public land already generate substantial positive net revenue. And where we've got the history and rights that have accumulated on public land, access, hunting, fishing, grazing, mining, we have to maintain those valid existing rights as public land managed locally for multiple use, sustained yield. And so The people that are out there saying they'll sell off all the land, it's just a ruse to maintain their stranglehold and control. But Donald Trump actually made the statement, well, we want to keep the lands great, and we have no idea what the states would do with them. So that's troublesome. Ted Cruz actually ran an ad in Nevada saying, you can count on the fact that I'm going to turn control over to the states. Marco Rubio, his state chair is the Nevada lieutenant governor, former law partner of mine, Mark Hutchison, and Rubio has made statements repeatedly. We're going to get local control and self-determination, control of the lands back to the states and the local people. I talked to Ben Carson. Ben Carson said, I think it's a great idea. States are good people. They can take care of their own lands.
Paula, she says, you say, quote, who we elect matters. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Of the Republican candidates, do you trust any of them, especially the one who is strongest verbally on supporting the Constitution? And will you name that person you trust to support the states over the federal?
We, as a matter of policy with the American Lands Council, we educate all and endorse none. We want to make sure that everyone understands and has the knowledge and courage to move forward on this. I will just simply tell you, you can go out and see who's putting their money where their mouth is. Ted Cruz is running ads in Nevada saying, you can count on the fact that I will make sure that you have local control. I don't know. I've seen and heard statements from Marco Rubio. I haven't seen as much direct information on it. And then, like I said, I've met with Ben Carson. We've seen ads and interviews in Nevada that he's done as well that have been very supportive.
Sandy asks, do you have a relationship with the coalition of Western states?
There are a number of things working, both through the state policy networks like the Idaho Freedom Foundation, Sutherland Institute in Utah, and others. There are organizations that way that are working. We've got a number of networks of Western legislators, but we've not really had the funding or the manpower to really build the types of networks and coalitions that we need to. This is money and manpower, so we really need to continue to raise funding, develop that network to be able to pull those things together. Guys, what's so amazing about this? You'll go on and you'll see these extreme leftist groups that'll come out and in the first paragraph of every article they'll say, "Oh, the Koch brothers, Koch brothers, Koch brothers." I will tell you right now, the American Lands Council has received exactly 0 from the Koch brothers. Where they get that article, they take our financials. Our financials are an open book. In, oh my gosh, 2012 maybe, I think it was 2012. I was invited to speak at an AFP event in Oregon. And then they reimbursed my airfare for $500. And so AFP Oregon showed up on our financials that we were reimbursed for $500. And because of, and I guess, I don't know, but I understand that AFP nationally gets some money from the Koch brothers. Therefore, in their articles, they come out and say, oh, the American Lands Council is funded by the Koch brothers. I wish we were getting money from all sorts of people all over the nation to continue to move this message. What's amazing, and I hope you'll take this to heart, this effort is moving because of people like you. We tell this story, we plant seeds, and they're blossoming all over the nation. I've been asked to speak at CPAC next week. Imagine that. I got into the Utah House. I'm just a dad concerned about my kids 6 years ago and thinking we need to go in and build firewalls at our state because the federal government is melting down. And this story is reaching all across the nation because people like you are relentlessly telling this story to everyone you come in contact with your leaders. And it doesn't take nearly as much money to tell the truth as it does for those that want to continue the stranglehold to tell the lies that they're telling all over the place.
Bill Ames asks, can you talk about the concerns the environmentalists raise about damage to the lands incurred as a result of possible mining or drilling on federal lands?
Yeah. Yeah, they throw that out all the time. A, look at what's happening already. Look at the Gold King mine in Colorado when they turned the river mustard yellow and no one stands to account. Look at what happened in South Dakota where the federal managers burn 11,000 acres. They burn down structures and fences and houses and animals. No one will stand to account. And yet the ranchers in Oregon that do beneficial fire management that accidentally gets onto a slightly more than 100 acres of federal land. And at the trial, the people said it was actually ecologically beneficial to the land. And because they want the land, those ranchers are going to jail under the Anti-Terrorism and Death Penalty Act. They're going to jail for 5 years as terrorists. I don't recognize our nation. This is not America. This is outrageous. So for them to say that the states would not be able to beat an F on land management is absolutely ridiculous. PERC has already gone through the studies that states outperform the federal government, hands down, environmentally, economically, and then just the sheer experience. You see the fence line photos all over the place. We'll start posting more and more of those. They're absolutely amazing. But that's what they do, come out and they play on fear. And the fear is, be afraid of governing yourself. I'm not afraid of governing ourselves. In fact, that's the only thing in the history of our nation that will produce peace and prosperity.
That leads right into the next question I've got from Karen Leeds from Tennessee. She asked, what would you have advised those citizens in Burns, Oregon, as far as an effective strategy in dealing with the federal government?
Yeah, so, and I'm assuming when you're saying those folks, you're talking about the protesters that came in with, from the reports, and we saw, guns and whatnot. There is a tremendous problem. There is a tremendous frustration. Again, going back to what we talked about, we're not honoring the fundamental promise of America. The statehood terms are the same. Oregon's statehood terms are the exact same as Illinois, that was 96% federally controlled for decades. They battled and got their land. But for the federal government not honoring the same promise, not honoring the same constitutional obligation, there would never be this problem in the first place. So yes, let's put the blame where the blame belongs. The federal government has breached obligations, has breached the statehood terms of the states, and that is what's precipitated the problem. Now, on our side, we've been asleep at the switch for far too long, and we're now starting to wake up. That said, in my mind, it's absolutely ridiculous to think that you're going to solve this fundamental constitutional question with guns on either side of the equation. Not on the federal side, not on the protesting side. This is a fundamental constitutional question that we need to have the debate, the discussion. We need to push that discussion out there. Now, protesting, absolutely. But you protest like Gandhi. You protest like Martin Luther King. The minute you bring a slingshot, that's the only thing the New York Times is going to talk about, which is exactly what we saw in this case. Protest, heavens, yes. That's the heritage of America. That's why we have a First Amendment. But the minute you bring guns to the party, no one will talk about anything else. The Hammonds, bless their hearts, the Hammonds have been largely lost in what happened over the last month and a half, and that in itself is a travesty, because what happened to the Hammonds was absolutely atrocious. Here, the trial court judge said they were the salt of the community, pillars of the community, that it was an accident. The judge said it would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment to sentence them to 5 years under that statute that they charged them on. And they went to jail for 3 months and 1 year. They served their time. They came back out. You have over-aggressive environmental groups, federal prosecutors, because they want their land. Bring them back to be sentenced again to go to prison for 5 years for setting a fire that was beneficial to the land because they're living next to an overgrown, catastrophic federal forest that's like living next to a dynamite factory run by chain-smoking chimpanzees. They know it's going to blow, and they try to protect their own land, and they go to jail as terrorists. That is a complete affront to the promise of America, and they and everybody else in America has a right to be absolutely outraged by that. But the way we express outrage, we need to educate. We need to educate peacefully. We need to educate persistently and relentlessly, and that will bring the sympathies of America. We need to tell this story. The promises are the same. Why are you treating us unequally? The federal government's constitutional obligations are the same. Why are you treating us unfairly? It's already been done before. Why are you denying us the right to determine our own destiny? And get that story out. And I would say it broke my heart, absolutely broke my heart to watch that showdown and the shooting of the gentleman that was shot.
The boy, Finicum.
You don't have to have a showdown and a gunfight to resolve a constitutional question, and that's what this is. Now, I will say, think about this too. So, remember what we started with the beginning. Government exists to secure our rights. Now, if you're on the land and you've been on the land for several generations, the federal government is supposed to secure your rights. That's why it exists. Well, it's not only not securing your rights, it's undermining it. But your state is so often impotent. It's a toothless paper tiger, and if your state is not stepping up to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority, as even Alexander Hamilton said, where do you turn? Where do you turn? And that is the frustration that is boiling all over the West right now. Governments have to step up and be competent. They have to step up with politically productive solutions, understanding their jurisdiction and exercising that healthy tension that is designed to exist in our federal system. Without the states creating that healthy tension, the federal government occupies the vacuum. And so shame on the states for not knowing their jurisdiction, not stepping up and pushing back and defending against this federal overreach.
Do you have any concerns or thoughts in regards to Obama looking at Governor Sandoval in Nevada and kind of what his history when it comes to land policy?
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? That was tremendously fascinating to hear about that. I would say I know the lieutenant governor quite well. Mark Hutchinson is a very honorable, good, solid patriot of a man. He is 100% with us on this understanding that the federal government's constitutional obligation, that the rights of the states are exactly the same on both sides of the Rockies. Mark is a very distinguished lawyer, trial lawyer. So if he were to step into the governor role, that would be a very phenomenal thing for having those Thomas Hart Benton-like leaders. I don't know Governor Sandoval that well. The fact that we could potentially have someone on the Supreme Court that understands Western issues, that could be an extremely positive thing. That being said, I don't know his politics, his makeup all that well. I was extremely intrigued at that suggestion.
Howard, and this will be our last question. I see folks are dropping off. So he says, which states in the council are aggressively seeking legislative approval to sue the federal government to take back our lands? I am from Idaho, and Jim Chimlick is a great voice, but is there any legislative
Yes. Arizona has taken legislative action. So has Wyoming, Idaho, Alaska, Nevada. Utah so far is still out in front. We're kind of the cutting edge moving forward on this. The problem that's happening is these extremist groups that fear their stranglehold slipping away, they have millions of dollars at their disposal. And so they weigh in and they do the fear mongering that, oh, you can't govern yourself. You would ruin your land. You can't afford to govern yourself. It's supposed to be this way. If you go back and look at the arguments that they made in favor of slavery back in the 1800s, they're remarkably similar to the arguments they make today to say you can't govern your own land. Remarkably similar. And so it's critical that we communicate to state representatives, senators, attorneys general, governors persistently, that we get our local leaders to communicate up the chain to them persistently, to have courage and understand their rights, and their duty is to secure our rights. Idaho has been looking at, they've done some preliminary legislation, some preliminary studies. I know that we've got some people that are up there in the next little while. The legal team that we have is meeting with their leadership. I was at a dinner with the Speaker of the House, Scott Bedke, a couple of weeks ago. In fact, we were together the day that Justice Scalia died. One of the remedies that the states have, that it is an independent remedy of the states, is to propose an amendment to the Constitution under Article 5 of the Constitution, to propose an amendment that the federal government, for example, can't own more than 15% of the land in any given state without the express consent of the legislature and the governor. If you'll search Texas Governor Greg Abbott, I would submit that Greg Abbott is probably the single greatest warrior for the rights of states in the United States today. He has announced the Texas Plan and proposed 9 amendments to the Constitution that would put teeth, real teeth, in the 10th Amendment, so that when federal agencies or the Supreme Court or Congress or the President take acts that clearly overstep the bounds of the balance of power, the states have teeth to reject and countermand and override what the federal government does. I would encourage you to go look at Governor Abbott's Texas Plan. That's a way where the states can act entirely independently to restore the balance.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Representative Ivory, for taking, gosh, we're almost going on 2 hours tonight talking about the American Lands Council and these issues. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please, I'm going to send out the recording link and the notes to everyone, so you should all have that in your inbox sometime tonight. Kale and Joanne say, thanks, Representative Ivory, great presentation.
Let me just say, Pam, that hopefully
Yes.
I've now cursed you all. We have the greatest opportunity in our nation to take control, and we have everything we need in our Constitution, in the resources that we have. We have everything we need if we will take ownership and drive our divinely inspired constitutional system. Or we can sit on the sidelines and watch it crumble away and answer to history for what we do. We have everything we need right now. It is up to us to hire and inspire leaders to go forward in our Republican form of government. Thank you so very much. You're now cursed. You're now deputized. Don't wait for anyone to say, go do this. Get on your own. Get the information. Get it out, and be so persistent in what you spread. This is literally the opportunity for a modern-day Louisiana Purchase, an economic renaissance for our nation. So thank you for your time, and Pam, thank you for setting this up. I'll look forward to seeing you all in Washington in a few weeks.
Sounds great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon. Good night, everyone.